So if you're an absolute beginner to materials inside of Unreal Engine, I just wanted to put together a little video for you guys to understand the basics. If you're ever looking for a little bit more information, I provide a link to a course I've created in the description, so feel free to check that out. Now, what we have here is this awesome looking car that I've built out of cubes, so don't be too impressed. But we're going to basically be applying materials to this car to allow us to learn the process. So what we actually have here are several just different meshes. This is just cubes and cylinders that I've kind of slapped together to make it a little bit more fun. And how I did that, if you're not aware, is I've gone up to this quick add project and shapes, and you feel free to create whatever you're looking for. Now, when we create these objects, Unreal by default, if I click on one of these meshes, if you see over here in the details panel, it creates in what is called the material slot, basic shape material. This is just a default material that Unreal is applying to your meshes so that they're visible. Now, let's say that we wanted to make the car red. How would we go about doing that? Well, first thing we're gonna have to do is make a material, just like this basic shape material. Let's go to the content drawer here, and I just have a generic folder. Let's just right click inside of this asset viewer here, and at the top near here we'll see material. Once I click on that with the left mouse button, I'm going to be able to name it. I'm going to name it mcarpaint01. Boom. And once we have that done, we now have a material asset. If I double click that, we can now start editing this asset. A couple quick asides: if it's your first time ever inside the material editor, right click, hold down will let you pan around to find stuff. Mouse wheel in and out, and left click and or left click drag will do the selections. What we can see here is that this material right now has some ability for us to preview. So this sphere up in the corner, if we click these little nodes, we can see different objects so that we can test the assumptions about how light works on our surface. But we really want to pay attention to is this main graph area. And if you draw your attention to this weird looking panel here, what you're going to notice is these little white dots that point to different words. And these are outputs. So we can expect to see this sphere over here, which is a preview. If I plug something into this, out comes this full thing, the material. So let's try that. Let's ask ourselves, well, how would we get a color in here? What is a color? I know that might sound a little crazy, but in a computer, a color is basically made of RGB values. And the thing we're really looking for is a term called a constant 3 vector. And that might seem very fancy and very over the top. And it kind of is, but it isn't at the same time. So once we find this, how we did that, if you weren't aware, is we just right click a single time, brings up this little search bar here, and then we can just type in anything we want. And we're gonna be typing in constant 3 vector. Once I've created that, you're gonna notice a few things. Just like there's pins in here to put to an output, we can plug things into them. So as you can notice here, this little white pin looks exactly like that one. And we also have 3 additional specific RGB channels. What we can do is we can left click, drag out, and drag this little wire, and we can plug it in. You'll see a little green checkbox come on, and we're gonna plug that into what's called base color. And at first, nothing's gonna happen. And that's because our constant 3 here, and we can think of X, Y, Z as RGB. I know that might be a little confusing at first, but think of the X value as being red, the Y is green and blue. And we can just show that right here. If I set the X value to 1, you'll notice that this material is 100% red with no green and no blue. If I add a little bit of blue in, you'll notice we get kind of a purpley pink color. And if I take it back out, that's where we're at. So feel free to change that color any way you want. The other thing we can do is you can double click on this and be more specific about the color you want to be. So this is the specific red I want. Once we're okay with that, we're gonna hit the OK button. And if I minimize this window a little bit, you'll notice, okay, now I have this created. What do I do with it? Well, first of all, you'll notice a few buttons at the top. We need to apply the changes to this material. And this is gonna kind of rebuild it. It's gonna allow Unreal to say, okay, I know now what you've done. I know how to use it now. That's okay. The other thing we can always do is saving the asset. You might be saying, well, what's the difference between saving and applying? Well, really, sometimes we want to make a change but not save it. We just want to see what it would look like and not be committed to it. So that's where the difference between applying and saving can come in. But we're going to click both of those and we can close it for right now. And back on our car asset, you're going to notice this big cubes. Whatever you guys have, add any assets you want. And again, over in the details panel, we have a area called material. And right here, you can see this material slot. And if I open up my content drawer, I now have my asset. Well, I can do one of a few things. I can just left click and hold down and drag it out onto a mesh. You'll see it added it now to that mesh. And I can actually come in here and hit the escape key so we don't have to see it. And at this point now, that is applied to that cube. Now, the other way we can do it is if I make a little bit of room here to make this easier. If I go to the content drawer and let's say the roof piece here, I'm like, actually, I want these to be orange as well. I actually have additional meshes here. Let's say I want those to be orange as well. I can come to the content drawer, and instead of dragging them onto the mesh, I can actually drag them into the material slot. That's another option. And furthermore, another option, as confusing as this might be, because there's 1,000 ways to do things sometimes, is I can just come over here and there's a little drop down. I can click on the word next to it, and we named it, let's say we called it car paint. Look, if I just type it in the little search bar here and select it, car paint comes up. And I can also select multiple meshes and do the same thing, type in car paint, as well as I can spell. And there we go. Now, let's say that we want the car to be a bit more shiny, or we want it to be a bit more dull. Right now, it's not quite working out the way we want it to. Let's take a look at our material and look at some of the other properties that are available to our material. Because right now, what we've done is we've said we specifically want to see just this color for the output. Well, something that's happening under the hood that you might not be realizing is that there's all these other inputs or outputs that are already enabled. You can see metallic, roughness, anisotropy, emissive color. These things you might not know about yet, but what you should understand as a beginner is that Unreal is assigning a value in here by default. So for example, if we take a look at roughness, this is basically, we think about a surface that's very bumpy or one that's very smooth. One that's very bumpy will not let light kind of as easily bounce off of it. It'll become trapped and become very dull looking. But by default, Unreal actually assigns a value of 0.5 in here. So if we think about roughness, we get a 0.5 value. We think about metallic, it's off. So in the computer, the way we think about 0 versus 1, right, is off and on. And some values in here that allow us a 0 to 1 value are that way because that is kind of the extremes of how it can process the data. So metallic is saying if it is 0, it is not metallic. And if it is 1, it is metallic. And why is that important to us? Well, it changes the fundamental nature of how the material previews. So let's plug in a little node here. So you might be asking yourself, well, can we plug a color into here? Why, yes, we can. And how we could do that is, again, we could right click and search for constant 3. But another quick shortcut is if you hold down the 3 key on your keyboard and then you left click, you can create one of these really fast. A little trick. So we could plug this into metallic and we could come up here to this constant and we could set it to pure white. And what you'll notice is that the material now has this different feel to it. It's because light is being absorbed in a different way. When we have objects that are truly made of metals, they're magnetic, and so they interfere with the way light hits them. And we could save this. We can apply it and save. And what you'll notice now is that our car has this kind of metallic fun sheen to it. So this can be another great thing. Now, lastly, let's take a look at a beginner's thing of roughness. And roughness, again, we can just use either a constant 3 by holding down the 3 key, but we don't really have color. So if I put this into here, you'll notice at first what happens is, okay, what happened? Now it's really shiny. I can see everything that's going on. Well, again, like we had talked about before with metallic being 0 to 1 based, the roughness value is also 0 to 1 base. And what does that mean? It means that if there is an object that is very smooth or an object that is very rough, right? This is saying at 0, the surface looks like this. And at 1, the surface looks like this. And then anything in between is just a value like 0.5. And so what that allows us to do is to do a lot of different ability to control how shiny the object is. So let's just plug in, instead of 3 numbers, let's plug in a single number. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to type in constant. And what this will allow me to have is not 3 channels, but a single channel. And I hope that makes sense. So instead of an RBG channels, we're just saying, hey, we have one number, and Unreal's like, ah, yes, I understand. You just want to know if it's shiny or if it's rough. So again, if I type a 1 in here, see how rough it is? 0.5 and 1. So I can do like 0.1, which would just be like almost shiny. So it's like a mirror. So apply that and come back, and we can see now our car has this kind of sheen to it, which is exactly what we're looking for. And at this point, we can talk a little bit about what specular value is. Again, you can see here, Unreal has a default value of 0.5. It's already assigned for you. So without even hooking anything up, it's kind of already decided what to kind of output for you in these different output nodes. Now, for now, we'll just do a talk about a high level, but we're not going to use them. Specularity is kind of like the light that hits an object, but doesn't get absorbed. So a certain amount of light will come in and just bounce off. But a lot of other light will hit and refract and go in all these different directions. But some light doesn't get hit and doesn't get absorbed and then change. It just glances off. And that is ultimately what specularity is. So by default, this value is pretty standard for most materials. There's only a few, so a lot of times you're not going to need to change this. Anisotropy, again, at a high level, this is kind of how an object's reflection and surface properties can stretch non-uniformly. It's a bit higher level, so we'll just kind of glaze over it for now. And then emissive color, if we ever wanted to make this car glow. Let's say actually we wanted to make some headlights. Let's do that. So I'm going to come to the little add guy here, oops, sorry. I'm going to take my cylinder here and I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to rotate it, and we're going to make some headlights. And you might be saying, oh, how are we going to do that? Well, let's just put 2 giant cylinders in the front of the car, so it looks really fun. Okay, now we got our awesome 2 cylinders, and we want these bad boys to glow. So what are we going to do? Well, let's make a new material. So let's close this guy out. Let's come in here, and then let's right-click, go to Materials, M, and let's call them Headlights. Headlights 01. Perfect. Let's open them up, and then let's take a look at what we would need to make a material that looks like a headlight. Well, what would be the color of that object? Probably just like gray. So again, we can just hold down the 1 key this time instead of the 3 key, and we can just make a scalar value. And if I put 0.5 in here, it's the halfway point between white being 1 and 0 being black. So we just get like a medium gray. And we're going to look into this node called emissive color. And when we pen over it, we see it says controls which part of the material will appear to glow. So if I come in here and I hold down the 3 key and make a color, and let's say just for sake of this, I'm going to double click and I'm going to put like a yellowish color on. What you'll notice is that if we apply this, we close it. If I come in here and I have to select my 2 meshes and come over the details panel, I'm going to type in headlight and search for it, if I could spell. Headlights. You'll notice that they take on a property where they're starting to kind of illuminate, but it's not quite there yet. So you might say, well, how do I make it brighter? You know, it's like it's the color I want, but it doesn't look like it's really glowing. Well, what we can do is we can actually use math. So some values in here can go higher than 1. And we do that through the math nodes. And so if I right click, search, and you type in multiply, and we'll get this little fancy node. And what this will do is we'll take 2 different values and we'll multiply them together and give you an output. And so if I take and left click and attach this to my multiply, and then attach this to emissive color, we'll notice that it says whatever this color value is, these 3 gets combined. Every single one of these gets multiplied by 1. So right now this gets multiplied by 1, the X, the Y component, and the Z component. Again, that is R and G and B. So right now this multiply is doing nothing. Our material looks exactly the same. But if I come in here to where it says 1 and I type in 30, what you're going to notice is that my scene darkened. It now feels like it's glowing. And if I pull this to the side here and I hit the apply button, you'll notice in our scene, it actually looks like those headlights are illuminating. And they really are. That's kind of the idea. And even with the lumen stuff, you're noticing it's starting to illuminate the environment. This gives us a lot of flexibility to build some pretty interesting materials. Now, to kind of talk about and skim over, because we're not going to get into them, we have other nodes like normals, tangents, world positions. These are things that allow us to affect the way a surface kind of appears. When we talk about normals and tangents, what we're really talking about, if I pull up my pen here, is we have points that kind of come off the sphere. It's just a normal is a fancy math term for what direction is the surface pointing at in the exact location we're looking at. And so you can think about these normals being all over them. So at every single pixel that makes up this object, we get a normal, and it is 100% pointing straight out. And tangents are kind of like the equivalent of these little right angles to those points. This not might make sense for right now, but if you get a higher level understanding of what those do, now you do. World position offset is allowing us to take points in space and move them. So either pixels or vertices, depending on how we feed data in. And we could show kind of how that works maybe here. Let me drop my pen here, clear this out. Let's take a look at what world position offset could do for us. So I'm just gonna save this real quick, and let's come back to our car. And let's make another material. Let's make one for the tires. So let's come into here and right click, material, M tires. Sure, why not? Good enough. Double click to open it up, and again, hold down the 3 key on your keyboard, left click, constant color, put that into base color. Now let's ask ourselves, would rubber tires be really shiny or really rough? And we got to remember ourselves, is it rough? Is it black or is it white? And if I plug in 0 here, you'll know pretty quickly, I see. Something that's really smooth, again, is 0, and something that's really rough. So I'm gonna put like 0.8, something pretty high, pretty close to 1. I'm gonna apply this. And I'm actually gonna make it pure black. I'm just gonna make it ever so slightly not pure black. And let's go, and that's, again, save and close. And then apply this material to our cylinders. And I'm just gonna click drag them out. Because why not? A little slow, but you get the idea. Okay, and now let's say that we wanna do something kind of goofy. We wanna see the tires look like they're kind of moving a little bit. Not that we would ever really do this for this application, but just for example. So just to teach us a little bit about the what the world position offset does. Again, we can think about every single point on this mesh is a pixel. So I'm drawing them in as imagining these little pink dots are pixels. And we can actually do math operations that say, based on, you see this little XYZ coordinate system down here? We can say, based on this, I want to take, let's just say, this 1 pixel. And I want to take its position, which it has a position in the world, right? We can imagine where it's at. And I want to add to it 10 units. I want to move it up, or to be more specific, 10 centimeters. I want this thing to go up 10 centimeters, and then I want to go back 10 centimeters. We can do that with this world position offset node. And that allows us to, again, affect each and every tire position on this mesh. So think about, when I plug something in, I'm not doing it to one point. I'm doing it to every single pixel that is affected by this material. That might be a little confusing, but hopefully it'll make sense here in a second. Let me clear this out. So let's say, again, world position offset. Let's get the, let's right click and do world position. So again, like we talked about with it just frequently ago, every single one of these points has a world position in this material. This is a little bit more high level, but hopefully it might not stick at first, but maybe you'll glean something from this. So now that we get every single pixel that makes up this mesh, I know that might be a little weird, we now can do things with it. And we could say, okay, let's take the, let's take a look at what this means. We have XYZ, so where is the position in all 3 coordinates? Or where is the position just on the Z axis, right, like this? Or where is it on XY? So XY would be just this plane. So we could move something just like kind of around, like it wouldn't ever go up or down if we just use just that pin. Or if we just want to go up and down with it, we can just use just the Z information about where that pixel is. So let's take the pixel position. Let's just take the Y, and let's do something fun. There's actually a node in here called time. And time is another input that allows us to get how much time has elapsed in the world. So this is constantly a number that is counting up, and we can use that to do fun things. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to do even more fun. I'm going to run this into a sine, S-I-N-E, is a sine wave. It is a value that looks like this. It is going to 1, to -1, and 0. So any value that's coming in here is actually always being turned into a value. So the output of this is either -1 to 1. And so constantly it's panning between those two values. So I just want you to understand. So even if I pass in 0.5 here, I'm getting 0. If I pass in a time of 1 second, I'm now 1. If I pass in 1.5, I'm back down to 0. I pass in 2 seconds, I'm at -1. So I just want you to understand kind of that this is just taking this value and turning it into a -1 to 1 value, just so that makes a little more sense for us here in a second. Now, once that I've done that, like how we did before with multiplying the emissive, what we can do is we can come in here and multiply a position of every single pixel, every single one. That's a little confusing, but at first it starts in pixel space. And that's not exactly what it's called, but it'll make sense. I'll multiply this by this and plug this in the world position offset. And you'll notice, look at this. So every single Y position, depending on where it's at, is being multiplied by that. If I do the XY, you can just see these fun, crazy results that are happening. And this isn't actually distorting the geometry necessarily. It's actually taking effect at every single point on the mesh. So the vertices will follow along, and we can get these really fun animated effects. So if I apply this just for hoots, and we come back into our scene, you can see how crazy this can get. And so how can we better manage this, because it looks a little insane? We could come back in here. Let's go back to our material. And let's just say that this value is a bit much. So we can multiply this by something less than 1. And anything less than 1, we'll shrink it down a little bit. And that will minimize the effect. So I can apply, save. And you'll see now we can kind of get our tires to move back and forth. Something fun. Again, just a demo just to kind of show you just what is actually happening with that. The last two nodes to kind of talk about at a high level here for a basic material is this ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is kind of like crevices. So this is like the idea with the ambient occlusion is that if I had a surface and it had a dent in it, what would end up happening is you would have light would be hitting the surface on the outside. I'll use a different color here. Light hits and bounce off. Light hits, bounces off. Light comes in, light hits, light bounces, loses energy, and we actually end up with kind of like a shadow in here, because either light energy is wasted and lost, or light can't get in. We can't destroy light energy, but basically it can't quite bounce deep enough to get into the cracks. It kind of starts to shoot around and either get absorbed and shot out in different ways. And we ended up with like a dark spot. And what ambient occlusion is exactly that. It's why do certain objects that have little cracks and crevices, they become dark inside? Well, that term is ambient occlusion. And so we can actually generate masks that have black areas and white areas, and depending on the area, it will actually use that. Now, the nice thing about this is that, again, looking at the surface and how the normals are projected, if I have this and then I have a light shining straight into the crack, Unreal is smart enough to then illuminate it. So this way we don't end up with situations where we have a surface with a dent and light is going in straight out, like say like from a flashlight, and it still looks black. This channel, packing it in this way, helps us avoid this problem. It allows us to have this kind of output, which is pretty useful in my opinion. Pixel depth offset is an advanced term that we won't go into, but at this point, you should have a relatively high level understanding of how to build materials, how to apply them, what some of the main nodes mean here, how we move around in the editor. And if you have more questions, again, I will point you to the description below. I have a full course that teaches you a ton more of the basic nodes that you might be looking for. So feel free to reach out and take that course or ask questions for me. Again, it's not just videos, it should be ability for you to ask me. And again, I hope you guys have learned something from this. Take it away. Again, have fun with game development. Try not to make the lectures always just so flat. And I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.